This is Infants on Thrones, the philosophies of men mingled with humor. We are the Quorum.
And this is part 2.
When we want validation, and that's what Trevor was really saying, like, here are the facts. If we still are looking for the church to tell us, yeah, you're right, those facts aren't true, maybe that's a problem on our end, because they're not going to do it, and maybe we don't need them to. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think there's a drive to want them to, because those have been the authority figures that we have sat at their feet our entire lives, and we love them and we crave that kind of validation from them. That's why earlier when I prefaced this, I mentioned the amount of time that Trevor's been out compared to the amount of time that others of us have been out, and maybe this is a reflection of that from time comes distance, and those bonds to those authority figures will reduce over time. But I think it's totally reasonable to expect that a church leader, somebody who was your mission president, that you loved and respected, and still he loves and respects him, that he would be able to provide him some validation and have this kind of conversation with him. But I don't know, I've never seen one that goes really well. I'd love to, that where they both get that, they come out of the meeting feeling like, yeah, that was really productive. We really touched each other in a profound way. And I think Trevor was touched by it, but anyway, now I'm really worried about everything.
No.
People are listening to this.
Don't worry about it. Yeah, we've got still 200. Let's see, over 200 people tuned in. Okay. Real quick, this conversation about prophets led to what for me was a low point in the interview. It's when Clark spoke up and basically just kind of changed the direction and said, what's the chance of keeping your kids going in the right direction without the church? And then he basically said, yes, the church has problems, but outside of the church, they really have problems. And tell me if you guys heard this. Then it seemed like he mentioned some Jewish guy for a second, but then didn't finish what he was saying about some Jewish guy. I'm assuming the Jewish guy had something going on that wasn't good in his life.
I mean, even in the church, we got problems. But outside the church, they really have problems. When the big Jewish people come here, the first thing they do is say, how do you keep your kids?
Right.
Said our kids are just leaving.
Yeah. Right.
And we had a Jewish guy here yesterday. She said, there's so many. So,
But basically, he makes a point, which I think if there's a hell, or at least a probationary hell or spirit prison, anyone who tells somebody you can't be happy, you can't raise good kids unless you're Mormon, deserves a special place in either probationary hell or spirit prison. Because I think that's an evil, heinous thing to tell somebody. Even if you think it's true, I think it's heinous. What did you guys think about that part of the conversation? Hammer, why don't you go first?
I heard the part about he was talking to a Jewish guy. I had taken that to mean that some Jewish rabbi had told him how many young Jewish people were leaving Judaism and were no longer participating. And so, but I have no idea. In other words, so he's saying, you think you got it bad in terms of how many people are leaving, young people are leaving the LDS church, the other churches are worse off, or other religions. I don't know. But yeah, no, I mean, at this point, like you say, he re-enters. We've now ceased to talk about the truth claims issues, and now instead there's it's the church's way, otherwise you're really not going to be able to have a great life either in this life or the next. And then he also, Clark has used this intervention, I think right at this point, to then turn it to attack Jeremy Reynolds, right?
Is that this guy isn't any more honest than you think we are.
Right, and well, the thing is this isn't taken directly from, obviously these things are in the CS letter.
His book, but I'm just telling you,
right.
He's not any more honest than we are, in your mind.
Right.
I'm just telling you a fact.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
This guy's not. For example, I know this guy promised he wouldn't publish his book before his mother died, and his mother didn't die, and he published it.
Right.
Which, to me, of all the things you want to look at somebody who's trying to get you to go somewhere is who are they really?
Right.
Okay? And so if you don't honor your mother,
I think it got to the point with him, though, is that he cared too much for it.
He cared too much for who he wanted to become. He's put himself over here as a prophet.
I think it's all in how you look at it. Because if you look at this as truth, okay, think about it. I know it's crazy.
No?
But if you think of this as truth,
okay,
wouldn't you want every person that you love to know the truth.
I understand that.
You know what I mean? So I think it got to the point with him where he was like, no, I don't want to wait for my mom to die because I want to share this with her.
But let's go one step further. So my only thing that I would add with that is that this guy should lay down the other side also. The church didn't do that in the beginning. I agree with you.
Right.
And I think we found out that was a mistake for whatever reasons. So I'm going to say wrong.
Right.
But they are trying now to do the other. And he doesn't even try to do the other. So he lays this thing out with these plates, and it's gobbledygook. I've read enough to know it's kind of gobbledygook. Joseph didn't do anything with them.
So in other words, you taxi, like, what's the motive behind the guy who wrote the CES letter? And this is where he comes in, right? With that guy's like, he is the head of a religion. He's the head of the anti-Mormon religion, that kind of thing. So I don't know. I thought that was not likely to win over Trevor anyway.
Before we get to Jeremy Runnels,
Okay.
Glenn and Lindsay, what did you guys think about the you can't raise healthy kids outside of Mormonism argument?
Oh, I thought it was heinous.
Did that bug you?
No, but I agree with you. I'm just yeah.
Oh, just making fun of me. That's good.
No, I'm not making fun of you. A little maybe. I think it's heinous. I'm just saying I don't want to be argumentative on this one.
Okay. Lindsay, what'd you think?
I mean, I think that doesn't matter. Just kidding. It does matter.
No, it doesn't.
No,
Yes.
I think it's actually, that is one of the mechanisms in this hierarchical narrative that we all subscribe to. That is one of the ways that we language and keep control over people. I mean, the term apostates has a function, and it has a good function where everyone loses but the church. And this is one of the narratives of apostates. In fact, everyone that I talk to that doubts, I think if they have children, their very last fear before letting go of the church is, how will this affect my kids? Maybe I'll let them still be raised in the church because the church is good for them. It is such a deeply ingrained narrative. It runs so deeply within our culture that our families are somehow more superior. And so it is absolutely fear-mongering, but I think, it's sincere in that I think he believed it when he said it. Like, the world out there is so scary, and look at how they're raising their kids. I don't raise my kids in the church, and to me, they seem like normal, great kids. But when I see other people's kids that aren't Mormon, sometimes that still sticks with me, and it's not right, but that's just how I grew up seeing the world, and it's awful.
And if we're talking just as a pastoral perspective, do you really want, let's say someone is going to leave the church, do you really want to send them with this nagging voice in the back of their head that they'll never be able to raise healthy, good children?
I think the answer to that is, we just don't want you to leave the church at all at any cost. So we'll say whatever we have to say. When I was doubting, I had family and friends tell me terrible things like fake it till you make it, things that go contrary to what we're taught at church. But I think that that's what it speaks to, is we will really go to almost any length sometimes to keep people in the church, even if it's unethical or immoral, to use a Mormon term.
Yeah. John Hamer?
Yeah, well, to me, I agree that this is what's happening, but to me, it just becomes so alien because for me, of course, it's been so very long, right? So you're talking about the difference between distance. So I'm the one here who's been out for since '88. And so I can never even imagine it that way. So to me, it's harmful, very harmful to be raising kids in the LDS church because of the messages you're giving them about women, the ingraining sexism and other kinds of things into them, which will be very impossible to overcome. In other words, it'll always still be with them no matter where they get to in the future. And so I guess I see it. It's hard to remember that then it's viewed the other way, like everybody outside of this are going to be harmed. It's rather harmful to the kids inside, I think.
Yeah.
Well, anyway.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't love that either. So I'm glad you guys agreed. So they go on to talk about how Jeremy didn't lay out both sides, but the church does now. It was nice that they acknowledged that Clark acknowledged that the church didn't always do this. But that was a tiny bit hypocritical, I think. They made the point that FAIR is not funded by the church, which was interesting. They went on to talk about the 8 witnesses and the 3 witnesses. Anything you guys want to say about the witness discussion? John Hamer, I know you're a restorationist. Any comment on the witnesses?
Not a restorationist. Restorationist is something different.
Okay, sorry.
Emma did not become a Strangite, so just to tell
I
Trevor.
was just gonna
So
say.
anyway, so William Smith became a Strangite, and William Smith signed on behalf of the Smith family. He said, me and all the Smith family are with me." But anyway, so there's no evidence at all, and Emma was not interested in Strang, and anyway, so that didn't happen. Likewise, though, Cowdery, they're saying not Cowdery. Cowdery did investigate Strang and decided against it. So he moved. His brother was investigating Strang. Anyway, he moved to the Wisconsin Territory. Cowdery is widely thought to joined the Brighamite or Utah, the LDS Church, or rejoined, but he got rebaptized. But he actually then went off with David Whitmer. So he's right in as much as all of the guys kind of became Whitmerites primarily, and so they're not with the LDS Church.
What about his larger point, though, that Joseph Smith himself discredited pretty much all of them, and so how can we rely on their character when Joseph Smith discredited them all at some point?
Well, except for the Smith family ones, right?
Right.
But yeah, so in other words, he got rid of all the Cowderys in Missouri and said really quite horrible things about them. And the early members of the church, when they excommunicated each other, they tended to then say the worst things they could think of about each other. So it's a problem.
Yeah. Glenn and Lindsay, anything about that before we move on?
I just want to talk about Jeremy Reynolds really quick because it was funny to me to hear, I think it was Elder Clark talk about fair, and then in contrast with how he talked about Jeremy Reynolds.
Right, yeah.
Like the arguments that he used for fair, like they're just, average members of the church, good members of the church trying to find the truth. But like that characterization wouldn't apply to Jeremy, who was like, he has terrible motives and he's like this dark apostate. And I think that's so funny. There's like no wisdom in that except for these excuses that we give, or these passes or apologies that we give to one set of people certainly don't seem to apply to Jeremy Reynolds.
Yeah, right. It was very ironic that he's saying Jeremy Reynolds dishonored the memory of his mother. Would you trust somebody who dishonored the memory of their mother?
Yeah.
Like, well, let's look at what Joseph Smith did and ask the same question. So you're right. He's not willing to apply the same types of criticism on one side as the other, but I think again that comes down to his faith. He's just not going to go there.
Yeah, he could have said Joseph lied to his own wife about the other women he was sleeping with, but somehow that's not a problem.
Would you be okay with somebody who lied to his wife and cheated on his wife compared to Jeremy releasing this before his mother died, even though he said he wasn't going to? Are you going to apply the same character assassination tools towards Joseph Smith that you did to Jeremy Reynolds? And of course he's not.
I would like an ex-Mormon to write some beautiful apocryphal story of Jeremy Reynolds in the dark of night, pleading with God, and then the light comes through and he writes the letter and gives it to the CES letter, because really that is how we want to characterize this, right? That like somehow he's the villain in this story, but really Jeremy Reynolds' story, I hate to, make this a trope, but it really is kind of a Joseph Smith story when you think about it. But the irony is completely lost there.
Especially because Jeremy wasn't gonna write the CES letter. He wasn't going to publish the CES letter. But then there was an angel with a drawn sword standing there the entire time saying, "Write it, type it, do it, publish it." Yeah. So the parallels are there.
and then Clark makes this leap, and this was sort of the second major low point of the conversation, where he says Jeremy Reynolds is the leader of the anti-Mormon religion, and he wants you to follow him. What'd you guys make of that?
It reminded me immediately of all of the bubbles, right? So all of the PowerPoint that lists what all of the actual enemies are, it's clearly written in that certainly some of the people were watching some of the PowerPoints because they've identified who the leaders of the anti-Mormon religion are, right?
Well, he left out one or two, but yes.
And it's he doesn't really know that much about Jeremy Reynolds, but he knows that the Book of Mormon talks about the Coriantans and the Nehors and all these anti-people that are going to exist in the last days. And so he's got this pre-established narrative that he just plugs Jeremy into. I think one of the reasons why I'm kind of pushing back on things as much as I am, and it's not just during this discussion, I've been like in this headspace for the last month or two, is I'm very sensitive right now to the whole us versus them dynamic, and the way that a group like the Mormon Church absolutely demonizes the world. And you saw Clark talk about that. There's us, we're great. Everything outside of us is awful. That was something that I really hated about the church. And I don't want to see that now in ex-Mormonism as well. I don't want ex-Mormons to fall into these traditional tropes and turn off the critical thinking and just go back into us versus them bashing. And I'm afraid that what I've been doing with Infants on Thrones the last 5 years and Mormon Expression before that is contributing to an us versus them mentality. And I think there's definitely value in that, because there's people in the us group right now, the ex-Mormon group, that are, and maybe for your podcast, John, it's people that are still in the church and they're still trying to make it work, but they feel separated from other, TBM members or whatever. So there is this us versus them that is creeping in. And so being able to validate, say, you're not crazy. We've seen this too. We've experienced that too. That's a very important balm. But then the flip side, the other side of that sword is when it becomes that we start demonizing people that are outside of us, and we go right back into that us versus them thing. So I think that's kind of what is motivating a lot of why I'm pushing back on things.
I love it.
So
I love it.
Fist bump, Glenn. Fist bump.
Fist bump, Glenn. It adds credibility. I think it adds credibility to what we're trying to do when we strive to be fair and balanced. And Lindsay, I think you model this really well with Sunstone. I think you're probably a shining light within Mormonism right now at trying to bridge the divide and be inclusive to everybody. So kudos to Lindsay as well.
That's my priesthood. That's because of my priesthood.
Speaking of your priesthood, and Glenn, thanks for the vulnerability about Infants on Thrones. Still love you guys, but I love the self-reflection. Lindsay, we've had probably 50 comments so far saying, just shut up and let Lindsay talk about polygamy. So now is the time. We are all going to shut up. We are all going to shut up and let Lindsay talk about polygamy. What'd you think? Tell us your reactions to the polygamy conversation.
Oh man, I feel like I'm going to let everybody down. There's not a lot to say. I feel like by the time they were discussing polyandry and polygamy, it was just like this argument where I was with Matthew Grow and like sympathetic of his approach until this point, and then I was like, why are you using these arguments that are kind of sexist? And now John Hamer would say that they're probably academically defensible, like how he says we don't have any statements from Joseph Smith, we don't have any firsthand accounts. I feel like that's consistent with a really good historian who is going to focus and give priority to primary accounts, primary documents. And of course, we don't have these with Joseph Smith. And as John Hamer and I know, this leads to this whole Joseph fought polygamy movement. And then he goes on to this argument of like ceilings were maybe a way for women to have access to heaven. And this is kind of where my head explodes, because I'm like, well, that's still not great, because then what we're doing is we're admitting that for women to have access to heaven, they have to have access through men. And that's not great. And people would say, well, men need access through women too, through sealing. And I think like, well, no, not exactly, because you could say, we don't say that we seal men to women because they're widowed, or maybe that they're, married to a less faithful spouse. Like we never see that. We see that argument with women, and it contributes to the inequity. And I feel like you could argue that the law of adoption is like an answer to that, except for the justifications for the law of adoption sealing men to other men. The justification is different. So that's just one of my thoughts.
John Hamer?
No, I mean, I think that's a very good point. I mean, one of the things that we have, so yeah, in terms of the documentation, there's a difference between history here and, let's say, the theological proposition. So Lindsay's talking about here, well, so you've used this now as an apologetic defense based on what the historical sources are saying, as like, well, we need to be able to secure these women's role, in the afterlife. So that's a theological proposition, and the reality is the consequences of that proposition are cosmic sexism, right? So in that way, you've by introducing or whatever, by trying to, and I thought that another one that they did was where that Matthew was doing there was he almost was trying to downplay sealing as being less. It's not really a big deal. They're just being sealed. It's just sealing. It's not like they got, it's not like marriage, or they weren't living like they were married or anything like that. So in some ways, the different kinds of historical, or in order to make a academically defensible historical apologetic, it introduces, or anyway, it relies on some very problematic things theologically.
What about oh, Glenn?
Yeah, me. I'm going to go back to the scriptures on this one, because when Matthew Groh says there aren't any primary accounts of polygamy, from Joseph Smith's lifetime, I would just want to ask him, then would you explain to me what D&C 132 is doing in the Doctrine and Covenants? What is it and why is it there? And, what would he say to that?
D&C 132, we don't have, and in terms of a primary account from Joseph Smith's life, most people have agreed that it probably is dating from Joseph Smith's life, right. But in fact, it's a document that we have that's a copy that may well, that many people argue, or a lot of people have decided that they want it to not be from Joseph Smith's life, and it's something that Brigham Young made up out in Utah.
Thank you for that answer, Matthew Groh. Can I ask a follow-up then? Why is it in the Doctrine and Covenants now? I mean, is this something because there's this distance in history that we should discount it then as not being as valid a revelation as others?
Because a prophet said so. Because a prophet said it should be there.
Glenn is absolutely right. This is what I'm trying to say. Those primary source arguments work when we're defending Joseph, but they don't work when we're supporting Joseph. You see what I'm saying? So right. You can say primary sources matter, and we only prioritize primary sources, but not when we're including them in the Doctrine and Covenants. That's a different standard. And we have the same thing with like Helen Mar and polyandry. Like, well, perhaps maybe Helen Mar wasn't sleeping with her husband, but one of the reasons for polygamy was to raise up seed. So like we use those arguments when they fit.
How about the priesthood restoration? Show me the primary documents on the actual priesthood restoration, right?
Right.
I mean,
well, there aren't any.
There aren't any.
So, and the sealing power, that's also an anachronism. So in other words, that didn't happen. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great point, Lindsay.
There's different things though. Like this is like Glenn and Lindsay here are saying, there's a difference when, this is what Lindsay, I think, was saying right from the beginning. If you're going to just what's academically defensible history, and that's what Matthew Groh is sort of saying, he's putting on his historian's hat, and what can you say about that? But that isn't the same thing in a way when your theology is your history, right? Because no matter what, academically defensible history can't be your theology. So it's a disconnect that happens.
These are great points.
And I thought that there was another point that Elder Clark made when he was talking about the smart people. Like I don't have time to study all this, but I defer to smart people like, Brother Groh here. And because he was trained by non-Mormons at Notre Dame.
Right. To understand that there are smart people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that aren't just trained by LDS people. He went to Notre Dame. Right. He's not just a Mormon wacko.
So that somehow gives him credibility, right? But to what John's just saying, Groh's not taking his conclusions about the LDS Church and vetting them through his dissertation committee from Notre Dame and saying, "Tell me, is my methodology sound here? Right. Are my conclusions sound here?" That's not happening. They're not having non-Mormon peer-reviewed results coming out of this. So, anytime we're talking about these things, I keep saying, like, I agree. Yeah. Never mind. I was just going to go to the facts thing again. I beat that.
I know.
Can we talk about polygamy just one more? There was another point I wanted to point out.
Sure.
Okay, so at one point, I think it's Trevor says, like, I don't want polygamy. And I think Matthew Groh says, well, who does? And I'm like, well, actually, a lot of people do. Because a lot of people that I know and work with believe that it's inherent in Mormon doctrine. And this is my biggest frustration. I'm just going to air this axe to grind that I know a lot of really good LDS historians who are kind of smug about, like, people going through a faith crisis because they don't have all the nuance, yet they refuse, they equate LDS with Mormonism as if LDS is like the only legit Mormon experience. And I'm like, you guys are historians. You should know better that Mormonism is far bigger. That's one axe to grind. But the other thing that really bothered me is they started talking about polygamy being essential for heaven. And this conversation drives me nuts because, he says, like, Brigham Young had this one quote, this one time where he says, you all have to be polygamous, at least in your hearts. But he said a lot of other contradictory things. And first of all, I was like, okay, did you hear what you just said? So let's establish that we're admitting that prophets say contradictory things. But I mean, we're not just talking about Brigham Young in one quote. We have John Taylor, we have Heber Kimball, Orson Hyde, Joseph F. Smith. They said these multiple times in multiple forums, in multiple different meetings, and And then it translated, you have lots of local leaders saying this. And when we talk about, here's the double wordplay that we inherited from Joseph Smith. And it's this idea that like, oh, you don't have to have plural marriage to go to heaven. Well, what does heaven mean? Sure, everybody gets to go to heaven. So you don't really have to be a polygamist to go to heaven. So everybody gets in heaven. That's already done. But to get into the highest level of the celestial kingdom, and if you look on LDS.org right now, it admits that in the celestial kingdom, there are 3 levels within the celestial kingdom. Why do you think that is? Because what's at the top one right up here? It's for the polygamists. And we don't say that explicitly, but that is what the doctrine is. And so, sure, you don't have to be a polygamist to get into heaven, but you do to get up here. And that's Mormon doctrine. There's no getting away from that unless you get rid of D&C 132. Maybe.
Well, and I think the way that they have tried to get away from that in D&C 132 is they redefine eternal marriage or the new and everlasting covenant, right? So they would say the new and everlasting covenant is what's required to be in the first degree of the celestial kingdom. And the new and everlasting covenant means that you've been sealed to your spouse, singular spouse, through the priesthood sealing power. And that's the way they've interpreted 132 now. Instead, we could go and just read 132, read it. It's very, very, very clear if you're looking at it through unbiased eyes that the new and everlasting covenant of marriage is polygamy. But in order for a believing Mormon to accept that, then it creates these other problems, and there can't be problems. And so it can't mean that. It must just mean what we're doing right now anyway, which is sealing people in the temple, which we say is required for a celestial kingdom. So where's the inconsistency, from that Mormon believing perspective? But it's because they've reinterpreted what's in 132 and what that means.
Lindsay, what do you think about the argument that polyandry is not a problem because Joseph never wrote down that he was practicing polyandry? Nobody ever wrote down when they were doing it, I'm having polyandrous sex. None of the women wrote down during the time they were in polyandrous relationships, I'm having polyandrous sex. And so we can't really worry about polyandry. It's probably just more spiritual stuff. What do you think about that argument, Lindsay, that since Joseph never talked about it and the women never talked about it, it must not have happened?
Okay, so first of all, I think that argument has to go both ways, like we already talked about. If we're not going to respect the primary sources of women, in this particular case, then why do we respect, their recollections later on to accept that Joseph Smith was a polygamist? That's part of it. But the second part is, it's not like we don't have no accounts. Sorry, I got my dog here. We have accounts of some of the polyandrous husbands who did not consent to this, who say, wait a minute, you look at Brigham Young's court case in Boston, Massachusetts, where he is on trial in the early 1840s, for bigamy because Augusta Cobb was married to another man. I mean, it's not like there's no evidence other than we just said it later on. So okay, let's this is what I say with the argument that, Joseph Smith didn't sleep with Helen Mar Kimball. This is what I say. Okay, let's take sex out of the equation. It still makes it very problematic because in the situation of Helen Mar Kimball, you're still controlling a 14-year-old sexuality. We do have the primary source account of Helen Mar complaining to a friend that she can't go to a dance because she's now a married woman. We know that her sexuality is being controlled. And it's the same thing with the polyandrous marriages. Is Joseph sleeping with the wives? We don't know this, but we do know it causes women to leave their husbands and come across the plains. We see this consistently. We see like Hannah Tapfield King. She gets a polyandrous sealing to Brigham Young, and she brings her Gentile husband, who is treated as a second-class citizen in Utah for a long time. Most women that get sealed polyandrously leave their husbands. That doesn't make it right just because they're sleeping with them. It's still a problem. It breaks up families, it causes distress, and it literally creates a sort of caste system for the men. And that's the justification for it, right? That their husbands aren't righteous enough. This is how Parley P. Pratt was murdered, because he married a woman that was already married. To me, like, you can say like, oh, like Mormons, why do we care so much about sex? Like, it's so funny. Polyandry is still a problem because it's dishonest.
Yeah. And this is the point that I wanted to make, which is that Joseph Smith lied about his practice of polygamy. We know that for a fact. And so if we just apply Occam's razor, Joseph was a liar about polygamy. So if he was a liar about polygamy to his own wife, then why wasn't he a liar and hiding about polyandry? I mean, isn't that what Occam's razor would just demand? Is that unreasonable? Anyone? John Hamer.
Well, I also, yeah, like you say, so he's lying. He doesn't, we don't have anything where he's revealing exactly what his actual feelings are over and above, like Glenn says, D&C 132 or those kind of things. And so he's speaking in coded languages and lying. And so this kind of crazy, like Lindsay says, this, I think, I don't know, the fact that Mormons are sex obsessed or something like that is why there's this sex defense or whatever that is like this incredible cordon around Joseph Smith so that he can have a sex defense. But what are we saying then about Parley P. Pratt, who's doing it? And then Brigham Young, who's doing it. So in other words, are those guys, is Brigham Young then not a real prophet because he was not following Joseph Smith's ever so pure way of having polygamy that didn't involve sex? So it's this spiritual, non-sexual thing, but then Parley P. Pratt has abused it and made it into a sex thing. And so I think that part of the issue is the sex obsession and also this kind of Joseph Smith obsession, and that actually if Mormons were to start to recover their real history, which is they're way more connected to and way more has way more affected everything in Utah, which is to say, let's look at Brigham Young and the Utah settlement and the 19th century history in Utah, which is really what has made Mormonism what it is. That's all completely unknown. It's a shadow box, and nobody cares about it. They've not even looked into it hardly, in terms of even ex-Mormons looking into much of that. So.
And let's just be clear that most, if not all, of the apologetic arguments around Joseph do not apply to the women. And so this is the part that makes me really angry and I get ranty about. We do a lot to protect the reputation of Joseph Smith's purity, sexual purity, but we're willing to throw women under the bus, whether it's saying, well, we can't take their accounts seriously because they're secondhand or they're written years later or whatever. Whenever it's convenient, it's always prioritizing Joseph's reputation. And I think that that's telling, and I think that that's inconsistent. Academic historians, in my opinion, should know better. Those arguments should apply across the board to all the sources that they're looking at. And when it comes to Mormonism, it just doesn't. I mean, we pick and choose when primary sources matter and when they don't.
Yeah. Glenn, any other comments about the polyandry discussion?
No.
Okay. Do we like the idea that he keeps saying that we can find Andrew Jackson or some historical American figure that married his 15-year-old cousin? Is that does that work? Does that logic work? Does that make it better?
It does for him. It does for some people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they've got, people have done the demographics of it. It's not common at all. I mean, it's more common on the frontiers. And, so in other words, there's underage marriages. Normally, the most normal underage marriage would be for people who are closer in age. So in other words, the woman is underage and she's found a young husband who's older than her. But anyway, so it was definitely a low class kind of maneuver. But in any event, like Trevor pointed out to them when they was making that kind of underage argument like that Joseph Smith is already, he's married to all these people. It's the difference here is really not whether you're having you've fallen in love and there's one really scandalous underage marriage. It is creating an entire theological system where women's role is being very seriously subordinated theologically to the men, right? They have to be married to people who are being made kings and princes of Israel, and you wanted to be sealed into that house if you want to be getting to the the highest role of the celestial kingdom, because women, all of those things are all male perspective stuff. Men have to have polygamy. Women just have to be sealed because they're not people in the celestial kingdom. They're how men or how people get to the celestial kingdom.
Right.
And I want to point out, like, now all of a sudden we're trying to normalize plural marriage. Like with Helen Mark Kimball, it's like, no, but guys, it was normal because she was 14 and everybody got married at that age. But polygamy, which is like this really peculiar thing. I mean, we were called a peculiar people. Polygamy literally drives the saints west. It's what marked them and brought them a lot of persecution. Like, which one is it? Is it a completely normal marriage system, or is it this strange thing? And we see that argument go both ways. And this is why I love Mormon fundamentalists, because they don't try to do those games. They're like, yep, polygamy's weird. It was hard. Yep, he married a 14-year-old. Not going to try to justify it. It was different because God's law is different than man's law. But we try to do this thing like, no, it's cool. 14-year-olds getting married to prophets, like that happened. That happened back in the day. So it's totally normal. Mormonism is not normal. That's the point.
What about, Lindsay, what about the fact that with the angel and the flaming sword, Zina was in her 20s? Did that make it better for you that an angel with the flaming sword was threatening Joseph? Did that make it better?
I mean, I still have a problem with,
I was joking.
Like underage stuff, but I'm not trying to discount that. But yeah, I mean, I guess it's a joke, but it's also not a joke when women have penalties around this marriage. Is that consent? When there's penalties, including the threat of hell, and if we do the adverse of that. So if you don't get married, we're saying that it wasn't essential for salvation, but clearly it was essential for salvation for many women.
Yeah, but it's also an egregious abuse of power on Joseph Smith's part, and it portrays a really abusive type of God that's basically forcing these women to be in relationships with Joseph. Do you agree or not?
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to say. So like we like to talk about sex, and I'm not trying to say sex with a 14-year-old doesn't matter. I mean, I think my record's clear in that. But what I'm saying is whether he slept with her or didn't, we're never going to know that. There's not going to be a sex tape published.
Angels above us are silent, sex tapes making.
To me, the most compelling argument is the fact that the situation even occurred at all. Sex or no sex. Like, that's such a Mormon obsession. It's the abuse of power. It's the fact that he used her parents, and basically they sold their daughter for salvation. That's a problem.
It's a little bit of a problem.
I thought it was this led to a really interesting divide between Trevor and the other two. Talking about, Trevor saying, the more I learned about Joseph Smith, the more I disliked him, because the more I saw how horribly abusive it is for a leader of a religious community to use the fear of damnation to convince somebody to become an additional wife, especially somebody so young. And, the more that Trevor saw that, the less he liked Joseph Smith. And then Grove's response was, well, I've been reading what Joseph Smith wrote, and the more I read of him, the more I like him.
The more I got to know Joseph Smith, the more I kind of started to despise him because of how he treated women, of how he just did certain things, you know what I mean? And his rise to power and trying to, and it's no wonder to me now that they were driven out of so many states. I mean, when you're committing crimes, polygamy is not legal. You're trying to marry people that, women that are tied to, state leaders, and you know what I mean? Like, you're going to have some issues with that. And so my biggest thing was I didn't know the depth of the polygamy of Joseph Smith, and I didn't understand the polyandry. Like, why would he marry women that are married to other men, priesthood holding members of the church?
It's a great question. And I'll just say that, I've had a very different experience from you in that I've spent a lot of the last 6 years reading what Joseph wrote and reading documents about him.
Right.
It's not an exaggeration to say that I've probably read almost everything Joseph wrote.
Wow.
With some stuff as we get into Nauvoo, because we haven't covered that as thoroughly.
Right.
And it's been a different experience for me. I've come to like him better. I've come to think he was more genuine. And so it's...
if you read his writings...
And I've also read plenty of the ancillary
Have you read the journals of the women?
Yeah.
And you don't look at that at all as abuse?
So I will say... let's be careful here, because one thing we have to understand about Joseph Smith and polygamy is that there's almost no contemporary records. So there's no journals. These women are not keeping journals. There's some reminiscences, and the reminiscences tend to support Joseph more than than anything, right? And so the difficult thing about Joseph Smith and polygamy, about novel polygamy in general, is we have almost no records that were created at the time.
I mentioned earlier, these two people that are sitting across each other from a great divide, there's this abyss in the middle. I just find it fascinating. Like I want to try and step out of it and not be for or against either side, but just say, what the heck is going on? How can they look at the exact same person, the exact same evidence, and come away with such different conclusions on this? And again, I think it goes back to the faith thing where Trevor said, no, faith is not going to be sufficient for me to believe in this church anymore.
How does Grow emerge from all his studying of Joseph, loving Joseph more than ever?
Well, we would have to ask him, and I bet he would be open to having that conversation with us. But yeah, I think so.
Okay. I'll reach out.
Oh, so I've got a friend that I was in graduate school with. We were in the ward together, and he's now the director of. He's a colleague of Grow's, and I reached out to him a few months ago and said, hey, do you want to come on to Infants on Thrones? We'll have a conversation. And he was willing to do it. But he said, right up front, I'm not going to have anything that would be convincing to anybody if they don't already accept these things on faith. So we both kind of realized, he was willing to come on, but what's really the point of it? It comes. So I think that Grow would be willing to have that conversation and to answer the question. There are legitimate things that he sees in Joseph Smith that makes him like him more. I totally believe that there are, and don't think it's unreasonable that there could be. But on the same side, I can see from my experience and Trevor's experience and yours as well, most people listening to this, if not all, that we look at Joseph Smith now very differently than we used to. And he's more of a monster and an abuser and a con man and all of these things than we ever would have possibly thought when we were believing in him. But so I can see why Grow. I can imagine it would take me some time to TBM whisper the Grow, but I think it's possible.
The part where I do actually think context does matter, because I agree with that. I wouldn't say that I like Joseph more, but I'm certainly more impressed by him, and sometimes impress would assume that I admire him, and that's not necessarily it. What Joseph Smith did was impressive, and I mean, just like sometimes I sit there and I'm in awe of it. I see the fruits of it today. I see how we sit around and spend, like, this guy has given us hours and hours and hours, thousands of hours of things for scholars to talk about. I mean, that conference up in Logan, I was thinking, wow, this guy, like, whatever his shtick was, look at what it's done. It's given all these scholars something to pick apart. So I can see the value in it. Just because Joseph Smith, did all of these things wrong doesn't make him less fascinating. But when you're in the angry stage, you hear that and you're like, stop making excuses for Joseph Smith. And that's what I think Glenn and I are inviting people to do. We're not making excuses. Like, it's not making an excuse to say someone was really impressive. That's not an excuse.
Yeah. Well, and not to TBM, or not TBM, not to anyway, historian whisper Matt Grow, but even one of the things that he said on this topic was, he says, look, we're all enmeshed in the culture of our times.
Yeah.
He repeated that a couple times. So in other words, you have to look at a person, where their background is, what their time and place is, and then when you read all the different things that they wrote, I mean, in this case, a charismatic person, you may well find yourself, very much more intrigued by him than when you had just, let's say, the regular narrative that comes out of a manual, which is to say, it's just a hagiography. So in other words, something that doesn't have any depth or substance to it. So you might actually find some stuff that you find very fascinating and interesting. I'm on record, I think, with Joseph Smith. I'm a rare person who finds him not very interesting. So I'd like for us to talk about, I'm interested in the movement and the history all around it. But I mean, I think he's so talked about anyway. So
what do we think about that place of the conversation where basically Clark says, he's quoting Oates, and he's basically saying there's always going to be a tit for tat. So so there's no, these are not the droids you're looking for. It's just like, there's always going to be a problem. We can never resolve it. So you may as well believe, because your children are going to be malformed if you don't. Any thoughts on that, or are we just going to say that's his perspective?
Well, I picked up on that too, and that he's creating a false equivalency that it's equally muddled. I think muddled was the word that he was using. It's muddled on both sides. You can never be sure on either side. So I'm going to side with my faith in God, kind of thing, instead of what the evil world out there is putting in there to muddle up things. But yeah.
Anyone else?
Yep, my takeaway was just that means that he and I think the other leaders, they didn't understand that there is a problem, but they don't understand what the problem is, and maybe this is why we've seen that there has been the essays and things like that, because they feel the solution to the problem is arming up and doing stuff that's academically defensible. But the problem with it is that there's still that final leap that we've even identified here, that when you create an academically defensible narrative, you still have to somehow jump to, why does that justify obedience, blind obedience to these authoritarian leaders, right? So that, that's the problem. So.
And I would say, yeah, there is going to be tit for tat. And so maybe that's not the real problem. I'm going back to what I said at the beginning. I can give you a fact about church history, and you can have someone give me an alternative fact. That we're going to go back and forth on me. To me, the debate is really about,
because they really don't matter, right?
Because facts don't matter.
I'm just teasing.
Let's put that on Facebook on my profile.
New
That's what I'm saying. Like, I think that this is the short-sightedness of how the church is approaching this. They already missed the boat for the fact for fact, tit for tat thing. I mean, people that are reading the essays are becoming just as disturbed. The essays are not really doing what I think that they hoped that they were doing, to maybe buffer the betrayal. I don't think that that's what's happening. I think that they need to come up with a different approach. For me, that looks like being more inclusive, saying, what Community of Christ has done, and say, well, yeah, maybe Joseph was making it up, and that's okay. You can still be Mormon. That's just how I see it.
Lindsay, I just noticed that you kind of need to go, and we've kept you at least 45 minutes past what time we'd say. Is there I loved what you just said. Is there any closing comment you want to make before you need to check out, or you have a few more minutes?
Just the usual. I hate truth. I hate facts. Back to church. Is there anything else? No, just that I would ask again for everybody to be more rigorous when we're talking about Mormonism. It's bigger than the LDS Church. I'm deliberately strategic in that I say the LDS group now when I talk about that. And so what we're really talking about is LDS Mormonism. Mormonism is bigger. It's certainly bigger than just our church. And that I want to acknowledge that people are in Trevor's shoes right now and they're in pain, and that's a very valid experience too. And thanks for letting me be part of this.
We love you, Lindsay. Thanks for your perspective. Hope you'll join us again. Support Sunstone, support Lindsay. Lots of events. Toronto, Salt Lake City, everywhere. Lindsay will be everywhere this coming year. So support Sunstone. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thanks,
now, really quick, I don't want to end yet because we haven't covered the homosexuals yet. And the conversation turns to basically Trevor just challenging them and saying, what are the prophets good for? And of course, Trevor's saying, where's the prophecy? Where's the seership? Where's the revelation? And there's a beautiful part where Clark basically says, proclamation on the family, duh.
Just look at the proclamation on the family.
I've read the proclamation of the family.
And back then everybody said, this is not a them. And look how it relates to where the world is today.
How so?
And so, in terms of beliefs about family, beliefs about marriage, and beliefs about this.
But see, it's a very homophobic document, actually, because it's saying that homosexual people that are born homosexual, that's what I believe.
I know, that's what I believe. We don't know. We would tell us, right. We don't know how they get to where they're at.
But to not allow them to be happy, and not be able to have a family, that's really sad.
But it has to. You have to look. Trevor, you say that God must have. If you believe in this God that set this whole thing up, if we were all homosexuals, there would be no. Pretty soon, the thing just ends.
Oh well, I'm not saying that we all need to be homosexual, but I'm saying let the homosexuals live a happy life as homosexuals, because they can't change.
Well, we don't let people that aren't married have sex to live a happy life, because that's what they believe they should have.
Right.
So, I think the church has done lots over the last little while to try to help that group. Okay? Mm-hmm. Perfect? No, because some of them would want to be married and have partners or whatever they want to have. I think in terms of right to work, in terms of all these other things, I think we've tried to, in terms of if you're homo, if you have that,
Yeah.
you don't act upon it, just like all these young people that aren't married, they can be worthy to go to the temple if they don't act upon what they would rather do and have sex and then get married later.
Right, except that they eventually get to have that right, whereas homosexuals never do. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, okay, just...
That's fair.
That's an obvious example
Right.
of prophecy. John Hamer, how'd you like that?
Yeah, that really backfired on Clark. So I don't know, because I mean, it just shows the thinking there, right? So that's what they immediately point to, and at a certain point, anyway, they were back and forth. I mean, I thought that Trevor did a good job of really pushing back on him. He's like, okay, that's what we're looking for in terms of new prophecy going on, and he goes down and in terms of the making an equivalence. Essentially, Clark makes this equivalence where he says, well, there's all sorts of young people who aren't married who want to have sex with each other, and that and that's just really, they shouldn't. That's a sin.
Not just that, but he makes the brilliant argument that if everyone in the world were homosexual, then human existence would end. Wasn't that brilliant?
Right, and then I did like Trevor's.
Also, if everyone was female, which is why men need the priesthood, probably. I know that.
Trevor's counterpoint was, I'm not arguing that everybody should be homosexual.
Right. That was a good comeback.
Really, I think it's something that Clark had never thought of. Oh, you mean it's not all or nothing here on this whole thing? Like, you're not making anyway. So yeah, and so then we even explained it to when Trevor even explained it to Clark, and he's like, but you're saying though that for the gay people that they can never get married, and it's not like the same as with kids or whatever, and so Clark is like, that's fair. And so he's never thought of that before, and so then he's like, well, the number of the temples we have. So he switched to look at how many temples we have.
And he mentioned the Perpetual Education Fund as well. Just really quick, John Hamer, I won't call you a restorationist, but as someone who studied the Restoration, are those the sorts of things Joseph would have called prophecy, seership, and revelation? Building a certain number of temples?
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Or a program?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that he would like. I mean, he prophesied that there would be temples, and then there sometimes were, or at least once in his lifetime.
Well, he got everybody to build the Kirtland Temple. He got everybody to build the Nauvoo Temple. Yeah. And what's the section in the Doctrine and Covenants about what's that house in Nauvoo, John, that we've talked about staying at?
The Nauvoo house, yeah.
There's like the mansion, or the Nauvoo mansion, right?
No, it's called it's the Nauvoo house, not the mansion. It's the brick building that's in front of it that they were going to build, and it's like, build my servant Joseph Smith a hotel, and here everybody shall have this much stock in it if they invest this much in it, and this sort of thing. So there was all kinds of things that counted as revelation in Joseph Smith's time, but it was a lot more meat to it than just saying, well, pretty much every Ensign article is revelation, right? So
but he also didn't. He didn't have this distinction between spiritual things and worldly thing, as far as commerce. We're going to start a bank. There's things that he did, and I should credit this to Brother Jake's wife Erica, who made this really great point years ago when everyone was so upset about City Creek. She said, I don't see that this is inconsistent with what Joseph Smith would do at all. He was always building things besides just church kind of stuff.
Right.
So would he build a mall if Joseph Smith was leading the Mormon Church today in Salt Lake? I could see that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, so I don't think Clark was bad on the mall issue, therefore, for that reason. It's just a matter of, I can see anyway. So.
Yeah, he basically says we need the mall to make money to do humanitarian effort. That's what he said.
Right.
And the money for the mall did not come from tithing.
Right.
Well, and that we need to have a mall so that Salt Lake City can have a urban renewal.
Did you like what he said? Did you like how he threw Detroit under the bus?
Right. In Chicago.
Chicago is quite nice downtown, by the way. They didn't have to have a big anyways. So.
But how, and to me, this kind of goes back to when Clark was talking about homosexuality, and he was seeing it very differently, obviously, from Trevor. Who are you looking for as a source of information? Like, who's informing your opinion on these things? And Clark very clearly tipped his hat earlier that when he was talking about Grow, that he got his education from BYU, but also Notre Dame. So it wasn't just a Mormon education. I wonder if Clark has ever gone outside of Mormon sources to really understand what's going on with homosexuality. And I doubt that he has, where Trevor clearly has. So Trevor can come in and say, people are born this way. And Clark will go, well, I'm not sure that we really know that. Well, why aren't you sure that you really know that? Because you haven't really researched it outside of anything that somebody in the church says about it. So.
Yeah. Yeah. I was really impressed with how thorough Trevor was. He pretty much covers everything. At the end, by the end, he's even incorporating the Mark Hoffman stuff. And I mean, maybe Clark mentioned that, but Clark was explaining how prophets are, you know, he actually quoted, I think it was Hinckley, we do a lot of thinking that we don't pray over. That's really interesting of an admission that there's all sorts of decisions made in the church that aren't prayed over. Did you guys find that interesting?
Sure. But how else are you going to describe that, right? I mean, because it's like, I mean, that's a clear, it's definitely a problem. So it's a new variation maybe on some things you do as a man, some things you do as a prophet, right? So that goes all the way back as an apologetic. But essentially when the prophet makes an obvious error, or when revelation fails, if there were revelations, when you do an action where you were, let's say, taken in by a con man, in the case of Mark Hoffman, people wonder, well, why would how can you take a prophet in, right? Why is Hinckley taken in?
Right. All right. Well, is there anything else you guys want to talk about that we haven't talked about so far?
Is there anything that people who are still listening to this want to hear us say?
They're actually there. There's something around Facebook Live where I think after 4 hours, it actually automatically ends.
Has it been after 4 hours?
Something longer, whatever it was longer than the Facebook limit. Yeah, because we started around 10. So we had to restart, and so we lost some people, but we're still up to 126, even though we booted everybody off.
But there's is this 689 comments on here? Is that what I'm seeing?
Yeah. It's been great. There's actually people writing that this hijacked their whole day, but that they loved it. That's what Rachel said. This has hijacked her whole day, but she loves it.
Me too. I
Me
put
too,
in,
Rachel.
I did some PTO to cover my time with this. So yeah, I took the day off. Yeah.
Sarah says she's been avoiding studying for her nursing exam. Anyway, we can invite people to ask some final points or questions, but I think this has gone on quite long. I think I want to invite Glenn and John just to make some summary comments. You can talk about Trevor. I don't want to throw Trevor under the bus here. I think this is sort of an act of courage. It's a sincere act. Some can question whether it was right to record and to share the recording without permission. But I agree with Trevor that when we're talking about a church that demands 10% of income, that keeps people out of temples, who don't pay their tithing, and they can't even see their own child's wedding, when gay people are killing themselves, when marriages are literally being ending, all because the church literally claims that their prophets speak to God and Jesus. I think the standards are slightly different in the sense that top church leaders should be held accountable for what they're telling people, that they need to be more open and honest about this stuff, and that there's a standard for transparency, I think, that's greater on an organization making such claims and demands. And so that's a justification, but I see what Trevor's done as an honorable and a noble and a courageous thing. That's my little sermonette about that. And that's also me giving John and Glenn stalling to give you guys time to give some closing comments. So while we're monitoring any final comments or questions from the listeners, Glenn, why don't you go first as to what summary statement you'd like to make?
I'm going to get in trouble for this. I know. I like Trevor, and I'd like to talk with Trevor more about some things. So Trevor, I'll be sending you a message on Facebook because I got some ideas. But so I don't want to put anything out there like I'm being critical of Trevor or anything like that. But you could have asked Grow or Clark if it was okay. You could have let them know that you recorded it and given them a chance to listen. I mean, you didn't have to just go and publish this 3 weeks after you did it and go, well, I think that they would be okay with it, and they probably should, and they do a bunch of bad stuff too. So if it's bad, well, they earned it. that kind of gives a little bit of credibility issue. If I'm a Mormon, if I'm a believing Mormon, and I want to hear what people are saying, I would immediately be turned off by that and go, okay, wait a second, now I'm not even going to listen. So I think in the approach, that might be a little bit of criticism. At the same point, I'm really glad that he did it. I'm glad that we have this to be able to talk about. I think it's going to be valuable and helpful to a lot of people. But I think so. For me, for a closing statement, it would just be to restate what I said earlier. I'm in a place right now where I'm trying to look at this whole us versus them dynamic and ask myself the question: is it possible to have conversations like this without always demonizing the other side? And I say always there because I still want to do parodies and satire, the things that we do on Infants on Thrones.
Says the leader of Infants on Thrones.
Because it's fun. Yeah. It's fun. And I think there's a place for it. But it's also not very fair to people who are on the other side, that we're giving them arguments that, they're trying to give a post hoc rationalization for something that they very strongly feel, and they really haven't thought it through all that much, and they don't really care if it makes sense or not, because what they feel is what they know. And so I want to try to be more respectful to that. Yeah, I don't know. So those are my closing.
That's totally fair, Glenn. 100% fair. And I'll just tell you, I was told that if I recorded my disciplinary counsel, it was me, it was for me, it was legal in the state of Utah for me to record it. I was told that if I recorded my disciplinary counsel, that I would be disinvited from my own counsel. And I can 100% guarantee you that Grow and Clark would not have met with him, would not have talked to him, if he was honest about it. And so that's a double bind.
Or even after the fact, if he would have said, hey, by the way, guys, I recorded this and I'm going to take it to John Dehlin and we're going to do this kind of thing with it, they would have said no.
Yeah, of course.
And if they would have said no, then yeah, it's legal to do, but is it still the right thing to do? And I'm not going to say no, it's not the right thing to do, but if part of our objective in doing this is to have friends and families of ours who are still believing members, hey, listen to this discussed, and talked it over so that they can start thinking about it and maybe planting seeds. I mean, we're not going to say, oh, well, we want them to be let out of the church. We just want them to understand why we came to the conclusions that we did in this. Yeah. That having something like this could be a deterrent to somebody approaching it and accepting it because of that fact. That's
absolutely super fair. Thanks for bringing that. And Maxine Hanks immediately texted me and said, this is illegal. Why are you doing this? It's illegal. I don't think it's illegal in the state of Utah. I think Utah is a one-party consent state. But even if it's not legal, it's super fair to ask if it's ethical. All right, John Hamer, what are your closing thoughts?
Well, I think that, in the us versus them situation, if Glenn wants to give equal time to them, he may be inadvertently giving equal time to the adversary. Just kidding. Just quoting the old Packer line. Yeah, anyway, right. But
can you quote it in the Packer voice though?
I can't. Okay. I need somebody else to do it.
I'll bet you could. You just got to go.
I can only do the anyway.
Because Glenn, that wouldn't turn off our TBM listeners.
No.
I guess what I thought was pretty interesting in being exposed to this recording was, well, I think that Trevor had a great. He's considering how. It's interesting always to me when people are new at the faith crisis, how an amazing amount of information you can absorb in a year and a half or something, because this is a very new thing for him. And yet he really, by the end of this thing, like you say, by the end, he was like a guy with a paintball and that was just going, and they were trying to get it with every last little ball there, and it was amazing. And so
I thought he was like Daniel-san from Karate Kid, where he just kept like, like wax on, wax off. And they'd bring one, but then there's this, then there's that.
Right. Yeah, and so that was what Matt Grow was like.
Yeah, they were all doing this.
So I thought that was interesting, and I thought that it was really interesting that, okay, so let's say go way back, let's say to the 80s or something like that, and so what we would have, getting the LDS Church and the LDS Church History Department to be in a position where they are actually talking about 19th century Mormon history in a way that's academically defensible. It was a pretty big transition from where they were at back then. And so I think that where Matt is at and where other legitimate historians are at who are in the church history department it's interesting that this is, that people have come to that place. And so anyway, so I think that was also interesting to see, and that it was even in private counsel. He's also doing that. He's not taking liberties with this stuff, I didn't think. Then in terms of and then finally though, in terms of the LDS authority here, it's just surprising to me, or not surprising, but anyway, just confirming to me that how little that he really was aware of what the problem even was. I agreed with him entirely when he was saying that Matt here is a lot smarter than me. So I don't know. It's just like, so it's very hard for them, I think, to this path that they've taken, which is to employ all these academically defensible historians and all this kind of thing, may not have any of the solutions that they think it's going to have or want it to have, in part because they themselves don't even understand what the real problems are here. And then the problems go well beyond the history and the debunking and the questions into all of the different social issues that Lindsay is talking about. And so at the end of the day, how do you get that last bit squared from where you were able to have these nuanced positions that some of the academics who are Mormons have to the authority structure, which itself then is the thing that is projecting the black and white literalistic perspective in the first place that doesn't match up? It doesn't work in the end. It's broken somewhere. The whole thing doesn't connect properly. So
brilliant and beautiful. I'll just add that in addition to feeling like Trevor was courageous, I think this is an important conversation because, maybe the closest we ever get to a really clear view of sort of what an average general authority in the 2010s knows and doesn't know. And it represents sort of the cream of the crop Mormon apologist scholar giving their best shots at as many of the possible issues as they can. And it shows in 2017 kind of where the church is headed in terms of, through its curriculum and through its public presence, attempts to sort of justify and dance around the big problems. I think this document, this recording, is a real important historical snapshot of where we are in Mormonism in 2017 and where we're going. Because you don't necessarily know the cameras and the recorders are on. And to me, that makes it a little bit more authentic and a little less staged than it might otherwise be. And so I think Grow, I think he was compassionate and kind and thoughtful, and I think Grow did a good job, and kudos to Clark for being willing to try and help out his former missionary. So in that sense, it's neat. They have to know at some level they're going to be interviewed and that there's risk that they're going to be recorded. And yet they do it anyway because they really sincerely want to try and help. Yeah.
They really sincerely trust that they're not going to be taken advantage of.
Yeah. They trust Trevor. Yeah. That's a good point, Glenn. But I think they know at some level this is a risk and they still do it. In spite of that. And so,
but if they knew this was going out to the type of audience that it's going out to, they could have prepared answers in a way that they would have been more comfortable with,
Sure,
so they were, so to your point that this is a good reflection or a snapshot of where general authorities are at this point in time. I agree with that, but I don't know that it's the best that they have to come back because they didn't put a lot of thought into it. It was just a private conversation they were trying to have to help somebody out.
Well, I think in Growth's reactions to Trevor, he represents sort of the cream of the crop of modern Mormon apologetics. I mean, certainly it wasn't a 4-hour prepared script of apologetics in detail, but it would be hard to find someone better than Grow who had the breadth and the depth of knowledge and experience to cover as many topics. I don't know. That's how I feel. So anyway, that's my little sermonette.
This is Winston. He's been barking at somebody at the door, so I had to put it on mute.
No, it's good. It's good. All right. So Bruce hey, Winston, Bruce does say that his bishop recorded his conversations with him and the stake president recorded the disciplinary councils and stuff. No, maybe I'm reading that wrong. I take that back. No, he says, my bishop recorded our conversation, as did I. So we don't know exactly whether the church records their conversations. Is that fair to say as well? Because they wouldn't admit it.
Don't know. Yeah. They don't talk about anything about disciplinary councils, right? Supposedly.
So we could sort of point our finger at Trevor, but do we know that the church isn't recording their conversations? I think that's
it's quite a leap to go from that bishop to the church. But
yeah, of
sure.
course. So all we're doing is justifying. If you listened to all this, if you made it through, even if you didn't, please consider supporting Infants on Thrones, and just $10 or $20 a month can make all this continue. So please support Infants on Thrones if you don't already. And thanks to everyone who does support Infants on Thrones.
Oh, thanks, John. You know, and I hope that everybody will support Infants on Thrones too.
Principles that
I've been around for a long, long time. I remember you when you drank my wine. Why can't we be friends?
The silence means that part 2 is over. That's what this means.